Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Hereditary. Good afternoon, Dr. Church. Welcome to the show. Before we start going with the show, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what we're doing today?
Sure. My name is James Church. I'm a colorectal surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. And my interest here is hereditary colorectal cancer. I've been involved with this for the past 30 years, leading the registry that we've had for patients and families with hereditary colorectal cancer, up until 2 years ago when I stepped down, and Dr. Matthew Kalady is now leading the registry.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, so we can just build an introduction for the audience about our first discussion today. So we wanted to build a broad definition and a picture about what does cancer mean, what are genetics, what is the difference between hereditary, genetics, and what's a syndrome. So just to establish that, let's start with our first question for today. So what is hereditary colorectal cancer, and how does it fit into the picture of cancer and colorectal cancer in general?
Sure, so hereditary is a term that just means inherited. So it means that we get the tendency to form cancer from our parents. In some of the syndromes that we're going to be talking about, there isn't a family history, and there are reasons for that that we'll get into as the examples come up. But the principle is that there's a risk of us getting colorectal cancer that we have because of genes that we've inherited from our parents.
So when we think about cancer, a lot of people panic and think about, did I cause this to myself? Did I bring it to myself? Is there something I could have done? So what causes colorectal cancer in general when we think about it?
Well, we can call colorectal cancer a genetic disease. Now, genetic is different to hereditary. Genetic includes hereditary, but genetic purely and simply just means that it's due to abnormalities in genes. Almost all colorectal cancers are sporadic. That means they're not inherited. The abnormalities in the genes come about by bad luck or by the effects of the environment or various things we eat and do or don't do, our body habitus. There are lots of risk factors for colorectal cancer, but these pertain to sporadic genetic changes that lead to the disease. Hereditary colorectal cancer only accounts for approximately 10% of the total colorectal cancer burden. So it's relatively minor and relatively uncommon. But the flag for it is the family history. So that's what makes knowing your family history so very important.
Okay. So just to establish a definition for the patients, when we say colorectal cancer, we said the word genetic. So that means they're predisposed to this cancer. When you say a genetic disease, does that mean if I'm a parent, I'm going to pass that to my child? And then on the other flip side, when you say hereditary, does that mean my children are at risk too?
So certainly when you say hereditary, your children could be at risk, yes. And we know that anybody with one first-degree relative, that is a parent, a sibling, or a child with colorectal cancer has an enhanced risk of getting it themselves. And that risk is up to 2.5 times the average population risk. And if that affected relative is young, it's 4 times the population risk. So that's very significant. For sporadic colorectal cancer, the only association with family is a shared environment. So if, let's say, your parents smoke, then you're at risk for secondary effects of that smoke yourself. And so it looks like the disease runs in the family. It's not inherited, it's just because you share an environment. If you eat the same diet, you're predisposed to the dietary risks that that entire family has. But it's not hereditary.
Okay, so narrowing back the topic to the word genetic, we said colorectal cancer is a genetic disease. Although we want patients to understand our topic, we also want providers to have an idea about what we're talking about. So when you say the word cancer, I know there are 3 pathways that could lead to colorectal cancer in general that we know of. And there's a very famous paper that both of us talk about every single day almost, and it's 3 strikes and you're out. So would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Well, cancer doesn't happen with one genetic abnormality. Rather, it's the end result of a genetic pathway where a series of genes have to be either mutated, inactivated, or inappropriately activated in order to end up with a cancer. And these genetic changes generally apply to a clone of cells. So in the lining of the colon are these cells called stem cells. And these stem cells basically live forever. And by dividing, they populate the entire lining of the colon. Because the colon has a lot of yucky stuff in it, the lining is changed about once a week. So these stem cells are constantly dividing and producing new cells that last about a week and then die and are replaced by new cells. So the colon is a very active cellular organ. As the stem cells divide, the DNA replicates to make the new cells. Each time that happens, the DNA is liable to mistakes, and these mistakes we call mutations. These mistakes are perpetuated in a new line of cells that has just arisen from the stem cell. In cancer, the mistakes affect cell growth regulation. So cell growth, because it's so important to keep it under control, is tightly regulated. But when cell growth genes become mutated, cells start to grow faster than they should, and they don't die when they should, and they start to build up, and they start to look wild. And this produces a clone of cells that's one step closer to a cancer. Then that clone will produce cells with another mutation that even advances the deregulation of cell growth more. And so it goes on in stepwise fashion until the final result are cells that can invade, and then you have a cancer.
Okay, so we established how cancer grows in a person who has a genetic problem, does not have a hereditary syndrome. We know when they have a hereditary syndrome, this pathway is much faster, and that's why we talk about seeing those patients more often. We won't get into those details, but let's explain, what does the word mean, hereditary syndrome? Hereditary is something inherited, but what does syndrome mean?
Well, a syndrome is a collection of diseases or abnormalities or traits, like properties of an individual, that go together as one disease. So by looking at these several individual traits or conditions, you can say this patient might have this syndrome, because it's so typical to see them together. So in any particular syndrome, not every trait, not every condition is expressed, but the combination of what is expressed suggests that there's an underlying root cause, which in our case is a mutation that's in the germline. There are lots of examples of this, and we'll get into them, but just for example, familial polyposis is expressed, that's one mutation in a germline cell, which is a spermatocyte or a oocyte that's expressed in every cell in the patient's body, and that is evident as multiple polyps in the colon, or polyps in the stomach, or polyps in the duodenum, or benign tumors of the bone, or cysts in the skin, or pigmented spots in the eyes. So patients that have these hallmarks make us think of the syndrome of FAP.
So this disease will affect multiple organs, and that's why we're calling it a combination of a syndrome. When we narrow the topic down to colorectal cancer syndromes or hereditary colorectal cancer syndromes, how do you classify them and how do you think about them?
So hereditary colorectal cancer syndromes can be classified multiple ways, such as by the pathology or the histology of the lesions that they produce, or in general terms by whether they produce a lot of polyps in the colon or not. And that's a helpful way of trying to classify them. You can also classify them by the type of gene that's mutated that causes the syndromes. But we really go with dividing them broadly into those that produce a lot of polyps and those that don't produce a lot of polyps.
Okay, so if you classify them as polyposis-related syndromes or non-polyposis-related syndromes, do you mind just running through big names that people hear of or people know about? And that will really bring us down to a roadmap of the things we'll be talking about in the next episodes.
Sure, so if we go through the polyposis syndromes, those are subdivided according to histology. So there are polyposis syndromes where there are lots of adenomas, and the flagship of that is familial polyposis, familial adenomatous polyposis. It's probably the most common of these polyposis syndromes. It's certainly the most well known, and we've known about it for a century, basically. There's another adenomatous polyposis condition called MYH-associated polyposis, mute-YH-associated polyposis, or MAP. There's a mixed polyposis syndrome that includes adenomas, but also other types such as hyperplastic polyps and hematomas. It's called the mixed polyposis syndrome, or hereditary mixed polyposis syndrome. Then there are syndromes of hematomas, and you may recognize the names as Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, juvenile polyposis coli, and the P10 hematoma tumor syndromes, which include Cowden syndrome. On the other side of the categorization in the non-polyposis syndromes, there's really only one major one, and that's Lynch syndrome. I think everybody has heard of Lynch syndrome. Another one not so often referred to is familial colorectal cancer type X as a non-polyposis syndrome.
So at the end of this episode, I know you're passionate about this topic because you dedicated the past 4 decades about it, and I'm newly interested and passionate about it. But why are we taking some time off our schedules and investing in making those episodes? What are we aiming to gain today?
Well, we want to point out to people that hereditary colorectal cancer is important. It's very important for a number of reasons. It's important to the patients that have it because these are rare conditions, they're life-threatening conditions. They're conditions that involve a lot of critical decision-making that you can only make when you really and truly understand the syndromes. So we want to help patients get doctors that understand the syndromes. And they're not the sort of things you can read about in a book and truly understand what to do. You need this sort of personal conversation to appreciate the nuances of care that are required. The second thing is that these are important syndromes for what they teach us about all colorectal cancer, because when you think about it, they're really accelerated versions of colorectal cancer. It's the same pathways, they just happen a lot quicker. And so by having access to these patients and their conditions and their lifetime of disease, we can see in an instant, really, what it would take us many years to see in the general population. So we learn a lot about sporadic colorectal cancer from working with patients with these hereditary syndromes.
Dr. Church, thank you for being with us today. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. I'm your host, Mohammed Abbas. Again, if you have any questions or any concerns or any ideas, direct message me or find me on social media or call us at the Jagelman Registry at the Sanford Weiss Center at Cleveland Clinic. Thank you.